Hello, this is a homily for the 16th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Our first reading is from the book of Wisdom, chapter 12, verses 13, 16 through 19. Our psalm is Psalm 86. Our second reading is from the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 26 and 27. And our gospel is Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 to 43. When I was younger, I had a job working for a great man who had made his fame and fortune in the real estate business, a self-made millionaire who had come from nothing, raised in coal country, poor and backwards, a great man who had worked hard, persevered in the hard times, kept his dreams alive, and eventually built a real estate empire across central Kentucky. He was a great man living out the American dream, living proof that in this country anybody can do anything and be anyone if they put in the work, and the time and the dedication. He was a great man, but he was also a terrible man. One of the worst people I've ever been around, and I have known some truly bad men. This terrible man was a prodigious liar and a cheat. He had no qualms about falsifying any document that needed to say whatever he needed it to say. He would flat out make up statistics and numbers to get a sale to go through. He would cover up severe health and building code infractions, pass the property on to the next person, a property that he had built with those health and code infractions, and he'd pass it right along to the next sucker. This terrible man spewed lies and filth and nonsense at an incredible rate. We used to dread seeing his Mercedes pull into our office parking lot, because we knew that the day would be spent hearing about all the consumer protection laws he expected us to bend, and all the fair housing laws he expected us to break. This terrible man was an overt racist, with no use for minorities at all, except Mexicans, which for him meant anyone from Central or South America. And he wasn't shy about it. He sat in my office one day explaining the ins and outs of why Mexicans were better tenants than blacks to a family from Mexico. And part of his reasoning that he told that family was that even though he thought Mexicans were dirty and slept in the horse stalls and brought in bugs, he said they were still better than blacks because they would gather a bunch of people together to cram into an apartment to afford the rent. So he liked them because he said blacks just wouldn't pay the rent. And the mother of the Mexican family very calmly gathered up her children and went right out through the door, talking about the pinchy gringos the whole way out. And he didn't understand why she didn't want to rent an apartment that day. This terrible man told us not to rent to blacks, especially young ones. He told us not to rent to people from the LGBT community, but he didn't call them that. In fact, he had so many discriminatory practices that I could really see why they had implemented the Fair Housing Act. If other landlords were half as bad as this terrible man, consumers were in definite need of protection. This terrible man was also a womanizer. He only hired women to work in his offices. I had been hired by his brother while he was on vacation. So he only hired women, and he tried to sleep with all of them. He would take them out to lunch, he would buy them gifts, he would come to their apartments, he would openly solicit them for sex sometimes. Many a female co-worker quit over the crazy stuff that he would say to them. This terrible man, this sexual predator, did have successes though. Some women were all in on having a sugar daddy. Some were intimidated into it. He especially liked to work on the undocumented immigrants that he would hire, and the poorer girls from the rough side of town that he always seemed to hire and stick into his offices. Many of my fellow co-workers quit or were let go for not complying with his advances. Of course, no one was ever fired for refusing sexual advances. Oh, no. This terrible man's daughter or his son-in-law, who were both executives of the company, they would start to make weekly and sometimes daily trips to the property to critique the lady in question's work in a very belittling and berating fashion, effectively creating a hostile work environment where the lady would quit or start calling in sick, and then they would let her go for that. He was always in the midst of a cover-up or a lawsuit, and his wife continually turned a blind eye. And this terrible man would brag incessantly to the rest of us about his sexual exploits with the employees. He had multiple girlfriends going on at any given time, and continually informed me that with a little money, one could have anything that one wanted. This terrible man, of course, is admired in the business community. According to some of his peers that I met, he's not well liked, but they are all impressed with his self-made style and the trajectory of his rise to prominence. This terrible man is allowed to exist and prosper in our world. He is allowed to do evil and cause others to sin. He is allowed to be here because of this parable today. He is a weed among the wheat, if ever there was one. And like the other weeds, he is allowed to grow and prosper among the wheat, because uprooting him might damage and uproot some of the wheat. This great and terrible man. This great and terrible man has put several of his mistresses through school. He prizes education. He even put me through graduate school, even though I wasn't his mistress. He has bought his mistresses cars, he's paid off their debts, he's rented them houses, he's co-signed on loans. He's helped many of them well after their affairs were over, years later, after he's moved on to another mistress, and he'll still help these women whenever they ask him, probably to keep them quiet. He's a great and terrible man. This great and terrible man is also a Catholic. He sent all of his kids to Catholic school. He greatly encouraged me to go through the RCIA program. He greatly encouraged me to start my own business. I think if we were still on speaking terms, he would have greatly encouraged me to go through the formation process to become a deacon. And throughout the 5 years of deacon formation, I thanked God countless times that I was fresh out of graduate school, that I was back in the swing of academic homework, that I was used to reading a ton of books, writing a ton of papers, that the training I had received in the UK history department had prepared me for the academic side of deacon formation. Because for a lot of guys in class, the schoolwork was hard. They had been done with school for 20 years, and now some professors giving them 3 books to read and 2 papers to write on Paul's letters to the New Testament, and it was challenging for a lot of them. But not for me. I'd been working on a master's degree at UK, so these 5 to 7 page papers were nothing compared to the 15 to 20 page papers that I was used to writing. Graduate school made deacon formation easy. Graduate school paid for by that great and terrible man, that no good, dirty, low down, terrible man. That weed had a wheat side. A wheat side that encouraged me to be Catholic. A wheat side that encouraged me to be self-employed. A wheat side that sent me to school to prepare me for the diaconate. A wheat side that made it possible for me to follow God's calling. A wheat side that I would have missed if God was pulling out all the weeds. And if a weed can have a wheat side, then it stands to reason that a wheat can have a weed side. Because we all think we're the wheat in the parable. Of course we are. We're the good seed sown by the sower, the Son of Man. We are the righteous who will shine like the sun in the kingdom of our Father. But just because we're wheat doesn't mean we don't look and act like weeds sometimes. Whether we mean to or not, our actions can be perceived as weedy to our fellow Christians. And they can push people away from their faith. And if we push people away from their faith, that is definitely weedy. And it is easy to do. Casting stones at the people that we think are sinners is a weedy activity. Even when we think we are doing it to educate and inform them, to teach them church doctrine, the changing pastoral practices as it regards the LGBT community is confusing and difficult for some of us. The church's teachings have not changed, but the church is changing pastorally by recognizing that some people have felt ostracized for their sexuality in the past, and that pushing these people away from their faith is a weedy activity. So the church is trying to be welcoming of all people, as Jesus tells us to do. The church still teaches that sex outside of marriage is a sin, but the idea is that it is wrong to single out the LGBT community as the only folks who might be having sex outside of marriage. The reality is that there is sin in all communities, all types of sin, among all types of people, and it's not up to us to judge. Trying to judge the other wheat is the fastest way to become a weed. But by the same token, we should not judge or condemn the wheat around us, who struggle with some of these changes. I recently read an article about Bishop de Kort, a Dutch bishop who allowed an ecumenical prayer service to take place in his cathedral as part of the Netherlands Gay Pride events this past June. The bishop wrote a letter to parishioners in which he said permission does not imply an endorsement of gay culture. He also stated that we are not called on to throw stones. If God counts sin, nobody is left standing. Bishop de Kort rightly realizes that it doesn't matter if someone is a sinner or not, what type of sin they do or not. Jesus loves all of us. He died on the cross for all of us, for all types of people and all types of sin. We aren't called to throw the stones. But then Bishop de Kort went even further. He realized that his welcoming of the LGBT community into his cathedral would be difficult for some people, and he did what he could through his letter to help them understand. But he also knew that this activity of welcoming wheat had the potential to end up weedy. So he asked that nothing be said at the prayer service that contradicted the teaching of the Catholic Church, so as not to hurt the religious feelings of our believers, he said. He knew that some believers would not understand, and that they could easily have their feelings hurt. Religious feelings, spiritual feelings, personal feelings, whatever. And it's easy to say, well, those people are wrong and they need to get over their hurt feelings. They need to embrace inclusivity. And maybe they do. But hurt feelings are part of what led to the LGBT community feeling ostracized in the first place. There were too many Bible thumpers telling people that they need to get over their hurt feelings, stop living in sin, get right with God. You're wrong, and either get over it or go someplace else, but don't expect any understanding or love or compassion from me over how you feel. That seems to be what our LGBT brothers and sisters heard a lot. Weeds, weeds, weeds from the mouths of the wheat. Bishop de Kort knew that whether the hurt feelings are right or wrong, they are still hurt feelings. They can still push people away from their faith. Pushing people away from their faith is a weedy activity. As God's children, we are called to help grow His kingdom by bringing people closer to Christ, not by pushing them away. When we push people away from their faith, no matter the reason, no matter the motivation, we are still becoming weeds. The bishop also understood that, like Jesus illustrated in the other parables in our gospel today, it takes time. It takes time for the mustard seed to grow into a large tree. And it takes time for the yeast to leaven the whole dough. And it takes time for all of us to come around to new understandings of Jesus' message. We can't fault our brothers and sisters who still struggle with their feelings. We have to be sensitive to them. If we are to truly be God's children, we have to love like He loves, whether we agree with each other or not. In the end, all of us have the capacity to be wheat, and we all have the capacity to be inadvertent weeds. We should all govern our actions accordingly.